Welcome, folks, to the latest Red Beer Live. We are talking here with a bunch of different guys about how to eat well when things are just changing, things are breaking down. We have Dr. Philip Ovadia, a heart surgeon. We have Mike Shelby, who runs an intelligence service called Forward Observer. We have Texas Slim, who is a beef rancher. And John Robb just joined us in. John Robb, who is it's always hard to describe you, man. Sort of like a futurist, but also a warfare strategist, all different kinds of things. In the next hour here, we're going to deliver to all you viewers the answer to three questions. What's going on? What's going to happen next? And what can you do about it? And we have four different guests here, so that's pretty wonderful. I want to start off here with Mike Shelby. Mike runs Forward Observer, where he has more ear to the ground in the US and around the world about what is actually happening with our food supply. When we say food supply, food shortages, when things break down, Mike, what do you think is actually happening right now?
Well, supply chain has been wrecked. Fundamentally, what's happening is the same thing that happened to the supply chain in 2020 is now happening to the food supply chain with fertilizer, and I'm sure everyone is aware. You know, I look at baseline expectations for me, and that is, are things more likely to deteriorate this year or more likely to get better this year? And I think we're seeing deterioration continue. I'm not seeing any signs at all that deterioration is over, and that leads me to believe that things will continue to get worse into next year.
Can you give us some flavor on when you say deterioration? Are you just talking about like the baby formula thing or what?
Well, the big thing for our food supply right now is not just fertilizer, it's not just supply chain, it's weather, it's drought, it's heavy rains that have delayed planting in the Midwest. Actually, corn looks to be not heavily impacted. Spring wheat is better than expectations, according to the USDA report, assuming all that stuff is accurate. So, drought, I think it's fair to assume that drought conditions will not improve substantially through the end of this year. And I'm completely open to the possibility that this continues to be a multi-year drought that does not improve. It might improve next year. But I'm just looking at baseline things that are happening now, and I'm not really seeing any signs that weather conditions will substantially improve, that fertilizer input costs will substantially improve, and certainly there's a lot to the downside. We're still seeing massive amounts of tenders for countries buying wheat and other grains and buying agricultural products. You know, the risk is that there's a lot of risk out there that the Ukraine conflict spills over outside of Ukraine, that things with China heat up. And so there's just a lot out there that could go wrong that would substantially worsen the food impact that we're seeing now.
This is the biggest garden we've ever planted this year. It is July 12th. We have gotten one salad, I guess two, because it was for each of us, and one small handful of radishes. And it's the biggest garden we've ever planted, over 1,000 square feet. But here near Seattle, the weather has been so bad that it's just demoralizing. We're just hobby farmers. We're like hobby gardeners. For the people making a living off this, it's just a whole different thing. Next, let's hear from John Robb. John, what is actually happening right now from where you sit about the food supply in the U.S. and around the world?
Oh, well, it's obvious that just-in-time infrastructure that we put together is falling apart. We had the COVID shock, and that was rippling through the system. And before the system had a chance to stabilize, we hit it again with the Russian new Cold War, and that set out another set of disruptions, and that's rippling through the system, and it's breaking down across the board. One of the things I'm working on for a report I'm putting together is taking the ultra high view. I mean, does this mean that, is this a step towards inevitable collapse, or are we going to get out of it? And one thing I was focusing in on is this idea of a thermodynamic trap. I mean, basic laws of the universe basically are thermodynamics. And there are ways of looking at human civilization as what's called a dissipative system. And dissipative system has to take in energy and expel entropy, which is basically pollution and disorder. And that worked okay as long as there was an exterior environment while we were subglobal. But once we hit global, we started to, poop where we eat, basically, and we were chewing up so much energy that we were causing that. There's only one solution to that, is that you go to space. You go to a bigger box so you can get rid of the entropy and get more energy. But we're not doing that. We're going exactly the opposite. We're trying to cut our energy use at the same time we're trying to cut the entropy production. And all of that energy use was used to build this complexity that's far away from thermodynamic equilibrium. And when you start cutting that energy and you start having the shocks associated with it, it just is a constant ratcheting down. It may be big jumps down as you start to collapse all the way to zero. And the only way that human beings are actually at thermodynamic equilibrium with the world is that we're actually like animals, like very similar to animals, meaning small tribal structures, hunting and gathering. Anything beyond the agricultural revolution or agricultural revolution on is away from thermodynamic equilibrium. It's ultimately unsustainable. So that's like the bleak high level view to kind of set the frame that this is not going away. We're seeing the kind of tactical and operational levels that Mike just went through. And now we're going to talk about the, some of the more pressing details in terms of how it's impacting our health and our future.
Well, so before we move on to Texas Slim here, Sri Lanka, what's happening there? Is that more like your standard third world government imploding, or is that more like a real risk with farmers not being able to have enough fertilizer and people actually not having enough food?
Okay, well, Sri Lanka was very similar to what we did with Russia, what we did with COVID, and what Chinese are doing with COVID, is that as you start to have these events, these disruptions caused by this global thermodynamic trap, the governments are responding with really strange ideas. A lot of times it's, how do we reduce energy? And in the case of Sri Lanka, they tried to convert all of these subsistence farmers and a little bit above towards organic farming overnight, and cut off fertilizer imports. And all of a sudden there's 20% less rice and prices went up 50%. And people were starving, and add in the loss of tourism revenue and everything else, the whole place exploded. Is that, a lot of the solutions that we have for actually living at a lower, more sustainable level aren't scalable. I mean, we're finding that with wind, we're finding that with other aspects of solar power, that the batteries that we put into the cars that we produce that are electric require a huge amount of resources to put together. It's going to be a rocky road. It's just, particularly with the way the governments latch onto an idea and then they implement it, and they're not thinking in terms of how it impacts the whole system, like embargo Russia. Mm-hmm. Well, that causes oil and natural gas shocks and fertilizer shocks and wheat shocks, and you're adding that to the COVID level. It gets worse and worse. So anyway, we can expect that across the board here too.
This is the optimism call, folks. Mike, Shelby, same question to you. You follow what's happened in Sri Lanka. Is that more of a one-off thing, or is that something we should be actually looking at for preparing in the U.S.?
Well, it's not a one-off thing. It's going to continue to happen. You look at a lot of countries that import 50, 80+% of their food that are also undergoing drought. They have urbanization. And so you have a lot of people who need to be fed, millions of people living in an area that cannot grow its own food. So this is undoubtedly, it is going to happen again somewhere else. It's definitely not one off. And actually the IMF has been warning about this, and World Bank too has been warning about 40% of, if I recall correctly, something like 40% of the world's countries are emerging markets that are at risk of not only sovereign debt crises as we go through this decade, but also a lot of them are going to have massive problems with food, especially if drought conditions and the food supply chain ends up being a multi-year process. And Brian, I'm sorry, what was the second question? Oh, about how is this going to happen to the United States? Look, we grow a lot of food here. I don't expect that we're going to have the same problems as Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is an island. They have to import their oil. They have to import their food. And we could be, well, we're a natural resource rich country. We grow massive amounts of food. I don't think anyone's going to starve to death here. But certainly I think food prices are going to remain high. I think food availability in the next year is going to be a problem and potentially longer. So I do highly encourage everyone to have some kind of risk mitigation plan. We're not going to be hit quite as bad as, a country like Egypt or Sri Lanka, but we are going to feel the effects here. We already have been for the past couple of years.
Okay. Texas Slim, you're about to go give us some hope, but before that, I'm going to go grab one thing, one moment.
Yeah, it's interesting though. Even the Germans made bonehead decisions based on a kind of more an ideological response to what was happening, and they eliminated those nuclear power plants. So right when they needed them the most, at the very same time they were building heating centers to keep people warm during the winter. So it's nuts.
So this right here is one of the things that you can do. If I can get it in screen here, this is one of Mike's books about getting less dumb. I'm going to subtitle it "Getting Less Dumb." We'll give you the links here in just a minute to go get some more materials like this for folks who are like, okay, so we're doomed. Great. But in the meantime, we're talking to Texas Slim here. Texas Slim, can you give us, for folks who aren't familiar with you, what you're doing and why you are optimistic? You're on mute, sir.
Got to unmute yourself.
Here. Sorry about that, guys.
You're back on. Okay. So the case for optimism.
Yes. Just to start off, Redbeard, I'm not an active rancher. To all the respects of all the ranchers out there that put the work in every day, they deserve all the respect in the world. I definitely represent them. I come from agriculture and ranching. But to say that, what we're seeing right now is a global industrial food shift. This has been planned for a long time. We've had four major consolidations of global food corporations since 1992. Throughout the years, the last one was done in 2017 and 2018. And that basically was a consolidation of global food companies, corporations, and also a consolidation of chemical companies. And if you look at food, none of us eat unless we have permission from a chemical company. And everybody needs to understand that. A lot of people don't grow any corn, any grain, or anything like that unless they get a permission from a chemical company. So, where we are right now is an orchestration, and it's moving forward, and it's not going to stop. You can look at the Netherlands. You can see everything that's going on in the Netherlands.
But the case for optimism.
Well,
Give
that's
us what
I'm
you're
gonna get
doing.
there. I'm getting there. This is the case of optimism. What we're doing is we're seeing a shift in basically a new consumer demand that we're creating because we're getting out from underneath that umbrella. And what we're doing is we're creating a whole new market access that is more decentralized and not basically dependent on these chemical and grain companies. We're going back to the source of the seed of how we got here. And in the beef initiative, what we do is we bring in ranchers that are out there that are growing and raising and stewarding the animal and the land. And we're giving the consumer access to that new market access that basically what our grandparents used to use in all of our communities that we came up with. And so by doing that and saying that, I think this is probably the best opportunity that we've ever had to basically take control of our own food supplies, to not have food insecurities, to develop these new relationships with the people that actually do basically want to feed us. And that's their life. That's their legacy. That's where they come from. And so we've started out this year and, we're selling beef now. We're basically people coming through the beef initiative and they're filling up their freezers. They're getting some of the best animal protein in the world. Right now, we're in partnership with K&C Cattle out of Central Texas. And, he's a regenerative farmer and rancher. And a lot of other regenerative minded ranchers and producers are coming in because we control the processing. We control what that animal is being raised on. There's no chemicals. There's no antibiotics. There's no steroids. We don't have to answer to the grain companies. The input cost of these ranchers are far more minimal. Yeah, they're getting affected by the drought and the weather and everything that we have as elements, but they're able to stand on their own 2 feet a lot easier because of the consumer demand that we're creating. People are figuring out, hey, I don't have to go and buy my beef from these supermarkets. I can go and get it and source it myself. And I don't have to worry about this price manipulation or the bottleneck of the processing centers. And actually, it's 10 times better beef that you could buy at the supermarkets.
We have our freezers full partly of half a pig we bought from a neighbor farm,
Right.
but they're not allowed to sell it to us, right? They have to sell us the live pig. Then we have to go through the butcher. Because
Sure.
our laws up here in Washington are just a mess.
They
We're going to
really
go
are. They're
to,
different, and they're different in every state. And everybody has to look at their state and their
yeah,
community and see what those laws are.
I actually buy a significant amount of my meat from Texas. Before that, I had to buy elk and venison and bison from New Zealand until
Right.
Force of Nature out of Texas figured out the legal way to sell me venison and bison and
Mhm.
elk. And it's insane to me that I live in a place full of elk and deer and I'm not allowed to go buy meat from here. I have to go. It's just, that's a different story. We're
Yes,
going to
it
move
is.
on to Dr. Avedy here for some more optimism. For any questions you guys have, go on Twitter at Redbeard Brian is me. I have a pinned post there. Drop your question right there. We'll have a couple of questions here in just a minute. Let's go over to Dr. Avedy. It was his idea to have this whole live stream. Dr. Avedy is a heart surgeon who helps people stay off his operating table. Phil, what's the case for optimism here with what's happening with our food supply?
Well, I guess similar to Texas Slim, I'm going to have to start with, where we're at and why we got here. And, we have been in a scenario now for over 40, 50 years where we've been presented with more food, and I'll use air quotes for food, that is not meeting our nutritional needs. And these overly processed foods have made us hungrier. So we need to eat more often, and have not, put us in a scenario where we eat a lot, but we're not getting the nutrients that we need. So when we are then going to be faced with a situation where the food is going to become less available, that is going to be a big problem, because for most of us, our bodies aren't in a state where we are going to be able to deal with that challenge. The statistics show that 9 out of 10 of us, nearly 90% of us, are not healthy or not metabolically healthy, and therefore don't have the capacity that we're going to need to get through challenges. So the optimism, the advice that I would give people is get your bodies in a better shape, that you're not addicted to processed food. Get back to eating high quality, real food, like the protein that Texas Slim talks about. And that will get you best prepared to deal with a scenario like the one we've been talking about.
How do you think about the future of food when in your book, Stay Off My Operating Table, you recommend a carnivore diet for most people, or more carnivore than it is now? And then you look at all the challenges we're having with how we're growing our meat supply in the US. How does a carnivore who's not going to be living off cans of pineapple and beans out of their larder, how do you think about the future and securing your own food supply for your family?
Yeah. So, again, I think the more that we are able to eat real food, that can be sourced better, that can be sourced locally, like Texas Slim talks about. And that, eliminates the problems of, food chain, global food chains that we're dependent on now, like John and Mike talked about. And, when you get back to eating whole, real food, you end up being hungry less often. You can meet your body's nutritional needs with less food overall. And I think that is going to be the best way to prepare for this. And those foods, animal foods can be stored for long periods of time. Produce, can be stored, whether canned or jarred, or all these techniques to store it. So these foods can sustain us through periods where food isn't available. And when we look at our ancestral history as humans, these are the foods that sustained us through times of, drought and famine that we've had in the past.
So that is a message of hope, mostly, that if you're eating real stuff, then you're still going to be able to go and connect with that in your environment.
I think the message of hope there is that we each have control of that situation. We can control what we're eating and where we're sourcing that food from. And so that's the message of hope, that you're not going to be dependent on someone else, to be really, providing for you.
Providing the crickets. You can grow your own crickets. So next question, and this is really for everybody. How can we know what is actually happening? That you folks, you listeners, here's what these four guys think about the current state of reality, but we're getting all this information from all different sources, and understanding what is real versus what is fake. It's just challenging to parse it out. And I want to start with John. You talk a lot about tribalism and swarms and information flows. How are we, over the next month, year, 5 years, whatever, how are we going to understand what is true versus what is someone's attempt to go make us believe something that is not true?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's a solution for dealing with it on every level, but in regards to your food supply and your energy supply and the things you need to get through the day and survive, you can source out people who have an insight into that, who can understand disruptions and understand their effects, and get 6 months to a year ahead of the things that are coming. I mean, the big picture, like I laid out right at the very beginning, is we're going to see a lot more of this, and we're going to see a lot more bonehead kind of government overreactions and as part of this permit crisis. But there's strategies you can do at the local level. I did the resilient community stuff a decade ago, and I used to write a newsletter on that. And the strategies that you follow as an individual is that you turn your home into something that's productive, turn your community into something that's productive. And you don't try to replace all of their inputs all at once. You produce some, the most expensive pieces. I mean, you learn about having a chicken coop. I could have a chicken coop here in Massachusetts, outside Boston. It's been grandfathered in over 250 years, right? But if you have one, you're always going to have a supply of protein. You don't even have to have a monster garden. You just have to have the skill sets necessary to expand it when it's necessary. My grandparents and everybody's grandparents here had gardens, and our parents had gardens, and that was like a supplement. And the same thing with your energy, energy production. It's not something you're going to try to compete with the market in terms of pricing on a day-to-day basis, or try to sole source it and become, completely off the grid. Is that you connect to the grid, connect to the system, the larger global system, on your own terms, and that you have the skill sets that you're building up and the mindset that you're building up, that as things start to drop off, you can replace them, and you can teach others in your community to replace them. Like, for instance, egg production, multiple places. Some people have more than they have than they need. There's ways of actually sharing that out, because the quality of the egg is diminished over a very rapid period of time. So the first couple of days, you get the best quality egg, so it's kind of like it's a you want to avoid the drastic kind of overreaction. I have to do everything. I have to go off the grid. I have to hide. Everything's going to fall apart immediately. Is that you just want to you want to connect to what's there, but do it on your own terms, and make sure that you're not beholden to it if things go wrong in different areas.
I want to try to summarize what you've said, that you can correct me if I'm getting it wrong.
Sure.
You're saying that you don't need to know exactly what's going to happen next in detail, because you can't, and that the best approach is to assume there'll be increasing fragility across every area, and then just make slow progress towards making yourself less fragile, and don't bet the farm on any one thing. Is that about what you're saying?
Yeah, and don't try to replicate everything that you get in the outside world from the global system at home or in your community. You're not going to do it. You're going to bankrupt yourself. You're going to overwork yourself. You're try to do that, and you're just going to wear out.
For about 5.
Build skill sets. Have your little victory garden. Have your chicken coop. Have your things like have your extra generator. Have the thing the whole house generator. have it multi-fuel sourcing for how you heat your house. So no matter what goes out, you have an alternative. You're that island of productivity. You're that island of stability. You ever go through like a big hurricane and everybody else is without power and they don't have any flowing water. They don't have anything. It's like, then you're the only place that you could actually get hot water and energy. Everybody comes by. You help them charge their phones. You help them, they want to take a shower after a week of not having, you offer them a shower, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of thing you want to be. You want to be a support pillar in the community. You want to be something that helps not just, your family, but helps everybody else in the area. And that other people will start to copy that.
Island of productivity. I love that phrase. Let's head over to Mike here. Developing that theme, you've talked a lot about in your Forward Observer company about how to build groups, how to go train your community, be a leader in your community. Can you share with us some of what you're seeing working around that island of productivity idea and how you're deploying that in your area?
I'm somewhat hopeful. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic. Humans are resilient. We learn. And I think what's going to happen over the next couple of years is that more Americans are going to start to realize that this is not just a one-off issue. Just like we see government can't protect you, it can't take care of you. Despite all the promises of cradle to grave, that stuff just doesn't happen. So maybe we should be a little more optimistic that Americans are going to realize, like John said, hey, I need to have a victory garden. And we need to start building community-supported agriculture. That's one of our big focuses out here. I run a preparedness network, and we're constantly trying to find new ranchers and new farmers and new homesteaders. And we have chickens and eggs and rabbits or whatever they have, and make that available through the network. And centralization is the enemy, and I'm somewhat hopeful that Americans are going to really start to realize that. And I'm not talking about a cultural renaissance here. Let's be realistic. But I do think for those Americans who maybe be inclined to look at being more resilient or being more self-sufficient, I think we are going to see a big comeback to having the greenhouse and starting your plants early, and getting the garden. The garden is not just going to be a springtime planting or a fall time planting. It's probably going to be people trying to grow food year round. And so those Backwoods Home and all those kinds of magazines that talk about this. So I think that's probably the best thing that we can do is build that culture of self-sufficiency in our communities. And it's great to do this yourself. Ultimately, I want all my neighbors doing this. And like John said, have delegate tasks or have some kind of division of labor, so you're not doing this all yourself. And again, decentralize all production, and that way your failure cascades are a lot shorter than what we've seen over the past 2.5 years now.
For people watching who get that the island of productivity, decentralizing is a good idea, and they like the idea of getting their neighbors involved, but then they talk to their neighbors and they can't get them to do anything or even agree on what the problem is. What have you found works for talking with neighbors that maybe are on a different page about what they expect about the future?
Yeah, that's tough. You really have to be a people person. Ultimately, what we're talking about is inform and influence. And, that's more a messaging problem. And so it can be very difficult because, anytime we talk about messaging, you have to identify your target audience, which may be one person or, maybe a family. And so, I think I go back to the polar vortex. I went around in 2021 here in Central Texas. I went around to all my neighbors and, asked, if they had blankets and generators and, what they were doing to prepare, and really just trying to, warn them like, hey, you need to be doing something because things could get quite bad. And I remember my neighbor at the time, Matt, he had 3 kids, lived right across the street from me. And I said, it's going to be, 0 or 5 degrees outside, you lose heat. It could be 20 degrees inside. How are you going to make sure you keep your wife and kids warm? And he looked at me like he had never considered that. So I think even just asking people, hey, what are you going to do if this happens? And as long as it's a realistic scenario, put them through the paces and make them say, I really don't know what I'm going to do. And maybe that will be a wake-up call. That's probably my first piece of advice there.
So I'm going to summarize that, and correct me if I'm saying it wrong. You're saying you don't need to change your neighbors. You just need to ask them and really get them to ask themselves questions that are not comfortable. That's all you have to do to make progress. Is that right?
Yeah. Get them first to understand the risk and then to admit that they're not prepared for it. And maybe you can spur some action. If you don't, I don't know, maybe we'll let Darwin take over. I don't know.
That's a different live stream. I used to buy the cheapest eggs possible, being a frugal Scot, cheapest eggs possible. And then I eventually ended up buying not the cheapest eggs possible, and I started buying the most expensive eggs possible. And then I started buying eggs from a neighboring farm if they're out, then I buy the most expensive possible eggs at the store. And it ends up being just a priority thing, right? Where when I prioritize, I'm going to spend as much as I can on eggs. And also, I'm not completely broke now. When I'm eating oatmeal and the cheapest eggs possible, that there was a financial reason for that, right? There's also this idea around how much is it worth to spend on food? How much is it worth to store food? How much is it worth to prepare in these ways? And I'm curious, Texas Slim, when you're talking to local people and you say, I'm supporting local ranchers, most people probably think, that sounds horribly expensive. Grass-fed, grass-finished. I'm not rich. I can't afford that. How do you talk with people and help them move from the place that I was at, where I bought the cheapest eggs possible, to this place where I'm buying the highest quality possible?
Well, I've been talking about consumerism. Consumerism is what got us here in the first place, and the ignorance of food and what truly is food intelligence. And so if somebody comes around there and they say, well, buying local beef is just way out of my price range. And I said, well, let's look at your health, going to, what Philip always, talks about, and it's what he's making a living doing. It's his skill, is that whenever you're consuming whole foods and pure nutrition, where are you saving in your life? Where are you saving within your lifestyle, in your kids' health, in your health, your spouse's health? You got to put things into perspective. And that's what you always should do whenever you're talking about anything that I'm doing within the Beef Initiative. Let's get on the same perspective here. And because a lot of people don't understand that right now, like through the Beef Initiative, to give you an example, we can give you 20 pounds of ground beef for $100. You can't do that in a grocery store. So what's more expensive, the grocery store or the Beef Initiative coming through a local rancher that does it in a regenerative way, that doesn't have all these input costs and doesn't have all these touch points that are people making tons of money except for the rancher? So, that's a longer conversation. And going back to what Mike and John were saying, and especially Mike, is that, what we have to really look at as sovereign individuals, and that's what we're trying to be for ourselves and our families, is this is relationship building time. This is a time of communications, that you do go out there and you shake people's hands. And you go up to the people that actually are the local producers, or people that do use the local producers, and you ask them to educate you. You walk up to them and you develop a relationship built on respect and pragmatic and first principles approach to our lives. And I tell people right now is like, you better be prepared to engineer your own suffering, or the suffering is going to get engineered upon you. And if you think taking a step into a good, wholesome, basically decentralized market access to food that's going to actually make you healthier, it's going to actually be cheaper in the long run, because how you can source whole foods is cheaper in the long run, retail and for your health. So there's an argument to be said that basically comes from maybe a point of ignorance of not truly understanding food prices and consumerism and nutrition. And it's that opportunity that you can educate these people. It's like point your compass a little bit in a different direction and understand, what is really going on with food the last 20 years, the last 50 years, really. And understanding what health really is, what nutrition is, and how you can source that in a different way, that it's not going to be more expensive.
That all sounds great, but how do I convince my spouse? Thankfully, I have a wife who's more extreme than I am about whole foods. But for a lot of people, even if they get all this, they're like, I'm on board, but there's this other person who's really important in the decisions that we make. about bringing
Well,
food into our house?
yeah, and that's a good question. You know, and how I looked at that from the very beginning when I started. I've been doing this food intelligence kind of survey for the last 3 years. One thing that I look at is true food intelligence, and you can look at where we came from and what people think they know about food and to where we really are within food. And if people want a consumption model based on those lies, then it's, you know, your spouse, it's your responsibility and her responsibility to take a step back and say, where did we come from? Where are we trying to go as far as a couple and as far as what our understanding of what true food intelligence is? Because a lot of times you look at a lot of things going on in this world as far as education. Well, we've been educated by the same people that basically got us here, and we're metabolically bankrupt as a nation. So
That's
if
a
you want to
phrase,
look at,
metabolically bankrupt.
well, that came from Dr. Ovadia. That was out of,
Yeah.
we were one of our first podcasts. Well, didn't the last 2 years prove that? I mean, 78% of people in the United States right now are obese or overweight. 46% of our children between the ages of 5 and 11 are now overweight or obese. 1 out of 2 of us is now diabetic or pre-diabetic. Is that enough proof for people to understand that we're going down the wrong path with consumption, with market access, and our understanding what true food intelligence is?
Well, with there, let's go to Phil here, talking about that, again, conversation with your spouse and getting people on the same page. In your work, you face times where you're talking to a client and the client gets that something has to change in their life, some aspect of their lifestyle, but the environment is not supportive of that. They all the way from they don't have a gym membership to their spouse won't stop stocking that particular food to they feel like they don't have time in their day. And there's just environmental challenges to doing what they know they ought to do. How do you coach people to, I don't know, be aware of their environment and then start changing that environment to support what good health looks like?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to recognizing your priorities and, you know, having that honest assessment, both with yourself and with your family members, you know, the other people around you, as to what are your priorities. You know, what, as Texas Slim was talking about, what do you want your life to look like? Just because everyone else around you is unhealthy doesn't mean you should be unhealthy. And it does take that sovereignty, you know, that Mike was talking about, that you need to take control of your health, of your life. And the people who love you, the people who surround you, should be supportive of that. And sometimes it's just a matter of demonstrating it to them. You know, you start the habits and they see the improvements. And then, of course, they want the same improvements, both for you and for themselves, and will follow along with you. But ultimately, you know, we have to start prioritizing our health. We have to realize that, you know, we should be healthier than we are, as a society and as individuals. And, you know, when you start talking about costs of food, you have to factor in, you know, not just what you pay for the food at the time that you buy it, but what is the long-term cost of that food? What is it doing to your health over the long term? And how much is that going to cost you if you're sick, if you're unable to work, if your life is cut short by, you know, the foods that you're eating?
That involves accurately judging a 40 years from now future, which I'm particularly bad at. Seems like a lot of other humans are as well. I'm curious, this is a question for anybody. When you see something that is an accurate statement about the future, like what Phil just said about you got to include the long-term cost here, what do you do that, or what have you found works for people helping people understand that 30 or 40 years from now reality and how they should change their environment today? Open question for anybody.
You know, one of the things I point out to people again is just look around you. You know, you can look at your parents, you can look at the older people around you and see where their path has led them. And if you're headed down the same path, if you're eating the same foods, if you're adopting the same habits, it would be foolhardy to think that you're going to end up in a different place. So you have to say, do I want to end up in the same place that they, you know, are at now?
Yeah, Brian, I would say even looking, humans are irrational. I wouldn't even approach it in 30 years from now. How about 30 to 40 days? What can you change right now in your lifestyle and your eating habits? And, this is a struggle for me too. What can you change right now? So in 30 to 40 days, you wake up and you feel better and your back doesn't hurt or your joints don't ache or, whatever, your blood pressure comes down, whatever. What can you do to enjoy your life and have a struggle less and enjoy your life more today rather than, 30 to 40 years down the road, that's important. But hey, let's talk about tomorrow.
It's really interesting. It gets me thinking what you just said, 30 days, not 30 years. And then what Phil was saying, it reminds me of what you say about what percentage of your attention should be on local versus international or national news. And one of the things you say is, what do you say, 70 or 60% of your attention should be local, something like that. And you talk about, combining with that, what Phil said about see what other people, what their lives are actually like. That if people around you that spend 80% of their brain power on international news that they can absolutely not impact in any way, and then compare that to the people who are spending 60 or 70% around local food supplies and, talking to your neighbor, something like that.
That's actually a pretty good strategy. If you can get your food shifted from the highly processed foods to more whole foods, they're easier to source. One thing I ran into in the resilient community piece was that the easiest things to grow are perennials instead of the annuals. But all the high quality, high yield products and the things that we're used to mostly are the annuals. But if you could switch your diet to the perennials, which is incredibly hard to do, it's a different texture, it's a different taste, but it has calories and it has the nutrients that you need. It's just that switching to something you do at this small scale locally that requires the least amount of work. Building a food forest, for instance, starts with the diet. And I definitely run into this in my own household, even with the stuff I grow from my garden, is getting it consumed inside the house. Like the Swiss chard doesn't sell, the kale doesn't sell, right? I'm the only one eating it all. I go, I love all the vegetables but the rest of the family's like, nope. Life is short. Let's not do that. But in terms of high quality food sources, like a kale is like amazing. It's all the nutrient buzzers.
We have honeybees. Last year, we lost both of our hives. We were able to get 3 pounds of honey out of it, which doesn't happen all the time. I think my dad lost 5 out of 5 hives last year. It's just a level of small scale beekeeping is nasty work. You're going to lose most of your hives most years, and it's just defeating. And I think, if I just didn't like sweet things, screw the bees. I want pollinators, but it's such a hassle compared to almost anything else. And it's so depressing when everything dies again this year. Whereas, potatoes won't let you down.
Well, I've had bad potato years too. This is where just, I got the worms and they ate them, and then I had to dig it all up and treat for the worms and make sure that I was rotating the locations. And man, it's a never-ending battle. If you've grown up in a farming family and you've watched the whole thing, how it all works, it is an ongoing battle. There's a reason why most farms are still mostly at the family level, is that the number of things that you have to deal with, the complexity of the task is so high that it requires an incredible amount of time and a lot of overtime and a lot of focus. There's nobody you could hire to do that job. Right? It's only somebody who's owning it and doing it themselves and willing to put the time in at that pay level that will make it work. A factory or a corporation couldn't hire somebody for that role to take on that kind of burden.
My dad's done some running of greenhouses, and his operative phrase is, he who controls the hose controls the profits. And he says, the owner has to have their hands on the hose because only the owner cares enough to look at every plant as they water them every day, every other day. And you can never hire anyone who care enough because the greenhouse margins are so slim, your greenhouse will fail unless it's the owner. which goes against the whole delegate everything mindset I take to in technology, right?
Oh, right, because there's no regularity to it. So you're looking at all these different little factors. You get a cold snap. You have a new pest that turns up and is proliferating. You have a new disease that comes through. You have labor problems. You have market changes. You have all these things. You have to keep them all in balance, and it requires constant attention and constant gambling, right? And
yeah,
it's not something that scales extremely well.
Our gamble this year, we spent 2 years since we've been in this house getting this garden to the state that it's in now, and then the weather this year happened. And the amount of planning, how many tons of dirt I've moved, how much we spent on fencing, the input costs are just enormous. And we've had one salad. And it's just, yes, gambling. It is. Let's move to a bit more tactical question of what we can do about it when we're looking at instability. We've done a good job of sketching out what food instability looks like and some long-range trends here and some other things. But let's talk about, like, what are you putting in your pantry? We have a question here on Twitter. Pantry staples to have in bulk. Let's get to that level of specific, do these 3 things. And maybe it also depends on whether you're living in a really rural or suburban or urban environment. Let's start off there with Mike Shelby talking about that. What are the specific things we can do in the face of food insecurity?
Well, I don't know. There's only like a billion YouTube videos on this, but I'll tell you, I'm not super prepper, but for the first time this year, I started stocking away beans, like vacuum sealing beans and rice, just because of the risk. Like, it's not just this year; it's next year and in the following year. Talking about other geostrategic developments, especially Russia and China and what's going to happen there. But so, this talk about staples. Beans, I would hate to eat beans and rice, so I've been drying, dehydrating fruit, and then vacuum sealing it as well. And I bought a dehydrator and a vacuum sealer, and that's taken up a lot of Saturdays here over the past 3 or 4 months.
So there's 3 things you just said. You just said you stocked up on food, but you also said you increased your skill set in the process of preserving. And then what was implied there is you're probably not doing this completely alone. So you're engaging someone else. So it's not a solo pursuit. Is that right?
Yeah. Mainly I walk out my back door and I look at my pear trees and I say, we're not going to eat all those pears before they rot. And so dehydrate them, can them, do whatever. But yeah, we got to start putting that stuff up. Yeah. As a family.
Doing stuff in community. That's a big thing. It's the opposite of the eating the TV dinner while you're on your phone. Everyone's looking at their own phone. It's the opposite thing from that. Let's go to Texas Slim here. Texas Slim, the question is, what are some very specific tactical things people can do in the face of food insecurity?
Like I say, I mean, to me, the most important thing is, understanding food itself, understanding nutrition itself, and then knowing your community again, knowing where you live, and establishing those relationships. But like Mike was saying, you look how your self-sufficiency, how it should matter in your life. I know I'm mostly a carnivore, so I don't have to worry about anything except pure animal protein. It's pork, it's lamb, it's beef, it's eggs, everything. And I look at the staples basically that are needed for long-term, food security. And it's all of an individual, effort, and every individual has to make that decision on, what is best for them. So I look at my community, I look who my relationships are with. I know my producer, we're very good friends. And, within that, there's food sheds all across this United States right now that a lot of people don't understand that are out there that are actually ready for something like that. I don't like to use the word preparedness. It's already going on to where it's just it's a lifestyle that you develop, and that lifestyle develops is knowing the people that do grow the right seeds, the people that do know how to preserve food, the people that do know how to can food. It is a community effort. It's a barn raising is what it is. And if anybody knows what a barn raising is like you get into a community, one farmer or rancher needed a barn, everybody came from that community and they had a barn within that weekend. Look at your food the same way. Every day should be a barn raising that you're basically leveraging your community, you're leveraging your skill set, and you're educating and you're being educated. When it comes to food, food in a cardboard box is not food, just no matter what the label says. And so if you're depending on finding your nutrition and your market access through marketing or advertising or labeling, well, those days are over with. And what you need to do, you need to get to the source of the seed of what you understand about food, and then kind of go from there on how you can better source it and how you can better basically have it at a longer period of time than you're used to. You know, I have 4 freezers that I keep big beef in. I have no food insecurity for the next year, and I will never go against that model and that lifestyle. And it's not a hard shift, and I'm willing to do that, and I'm willing to feed my family. My father's 81 years old, my mother's 77. They don't have to worry about food. My son is 18 years old today. He does not have to worry about food. And so that is because that I look at food a different way than most other people. And so you do that shift of awareness and intentionality, then you find out what truly works best for you.
So here's an action step out of all that, folks. Find your butcher and learn their first name. I grew up thinking having your own butcher, that was some kind of anachronistic thing, like riding around in a horse and buggy. And now my butcher's name is John. When he's in his shop, when I'm there, I say, "Hi, John." He talks to me about meat. This guy is the most in love with meat guy in the world. He inspects every animal when it comes off the truck. Just learn your butcher's name. And that's just one very specific, very simple thing we can do. Let's go to Dr. Avedy here. What is something actionable people can do to deal with food insecurity?
Yeah, so I think the best piece of advice I can give people is find a way to eat that makes you hungry less often. And, you know, that's really what it comes down to, because if we are if we are facing true food scarcity, you're not going to be able to eat every 2 hours like most Americans do these days. You know, you're not going to be eating 8 times a day. And so you need to find a way to eat that makes you hungry less often. And the way to do that is to eat high quality, nutrient dense foods.
Beautiful. John, same question to you.
Yeah, I like the barn raising. I always saw the barn raising as a community coming together to take a family and make them a productive pillar of that community and get them up right away. They're viable. They can produce. And you know, in this context, is trying to reskill. One of the great ways they actually get skilled up is if you have access to it, a community garden where there's lots of people with different plots, and there's lots of knowledge in there on how to grow. I mean, there's people who've been doing it for 20, 30 years. They have their plot, and they'll teach you and they'll work with you on how to get the productivity up. Because trying to do it all alone through books and other things is tough. So reskilling, don't have to do it all the time. Just know how to do it. Know how to do canning. Know how to do all that stuff. It's like once you've done it a couple of times, you have some of the basics. You don't have to do it all the time. And connecting with the community members who have skills and knowledge that you can transfer it to yourself, and you can then share with others and raise them up. And talking to the producers. I mean, we have people who do free range chickens and all the kind of things that you would normally look for from the supermarket can be produced locally, and you just have to source them. Some are a little more expensive than others, but hey, while we still have that kind of premium income, spend it, keep them going.
Yeah.
And then buy. One thing we do here in the States is different from Europe and a lot of other places, that we buy a lot of stuff cheaply, right? It happens, and your house is full of stuff. Everything is, we buy tons of stuff. And you go around the world and you'll find that people buy very few things and they spend a lot of money on them. And they have fewer things. And the same logic applies to food, is that you spend more money on the high quality foods. and you eat less of them, and you're healthier as a result. And rather than just the volume of low cost, stuff that just feels good at the time but wrecks you long term.
I used to be very proud of myself that I could buy chickens for $6 a chicken at Winco, a local discount employee-owned food store. I thought, I'm a champion. $6 a chicken. I can get 4 meals out of that sucker. And now I'm spending $30 a chicken to buy from a local farmer. 5 times the price. Except, of course, the chicken, it's only a chicken, and like in a tangential sense are these two things related. There's just such different things than back when I was buying the cheapest thing possible.
I have a question for Philip. Do you know if you used to have this? I heard this once. Is that chicken eggs in the first 2 days have almost no cholesterol? It was interesting. I would just, is that it only picks up over as the egg ages. But
I never heard of that. Is that true?
I was like, whoa. But you're not a person that's worried about cholesterol in general as a factor,
Yeah, I will say that I have less concerns about cholesterol, for people who are overall healthy. I don't know the details of cholesterol levels in chicken eggs of different ages, I guess I would say. I don't know if Texas might have some insight on that, but I have not heard that one before, John.
Yeah, it's like the first 2 days, none. And then it's like the opposite of when you get high end, or you get fruit, and most of the sweet kind of vegetables and the like, is that they pack it, they've genetically engineered it or bred it to have incredible amounts of sugar, because the sugar drops off by half between 3 to 7 days. And so if you get it too close, you get like this high sugar impact. It's an interesting thing. Is like the freshness impacts how much sugar, how much nutrition, how what the balance of things is in what you're eating.
Yeah, certainly, and similar to what Brian was talking about with the chicken, the difference between your standard factory raised store bought cheap eggs and a high quality egg straight from the farm, that that the chicken got fed a high quality diet, is really astronomical. And the fact that we even call both of those things the same is really part of the problem with our food environment.
Yeah, if you get sweet corn that's been picked within a day or two, yeah, that's just it's so different than anything you could buy. It's just like eating it. It's just, yeah.
I remember pulling my first carrot out of my own garden, and the smell of the carrot was everywhere. And I thought, how can the carrot smell like this? And that's when I understood that, oh, that's normal. A carrot that does not smell of carrot is not normal. We're coming up here, folks, at the top of the hour. So what I'd like to do now is, all these guys here have ways that are helping people deal with food insecurity. And I'd love to hear from each person, just briefly, what it is you're doing to go and help people address this issue. Mike, you're up first.
What we do at Ford Observer is provide evidence for things that we think are going to happen in the future. We look at second and third order effects, the follow-on effects. This thing happens in Ukraine, and okay, what's the U.S. nexus? One of the questions you ask is, how can you find reliable information? And first of all, shut off mainstream media. That's the absolutely first thing I would do. My wife stopped watching the news. She is in a much better, she's just night and day, just with worry and everything. And so the big thing is, there's so many predictions out there, especially on YouTube. The world's ending. There's going to be people dying in the streets and starving to death. I don't think that's the case. So, if you want to look at the data as we come across it and piece it together, you can find our work at forwardobserver.com.
Great. Thank you. Texas Slim, can you tell us a bit more about how to get started for folks, and what area are you serving with your beef initiative?
Well, right now, we're We're doing a lot of different things that are helping the people out there find a different market access. And one thing we're doing is education. We're pulling off 4 conferences this year. We're having one in Colorado in a week. And basically everything that you'd like to know about the Beef Initiative and what we're doing. One thing I want to point out right now, if you want to source a new form of beef that is the best beef in the world, and I'm not shilling here, I'm letting people know that we are shipping beef. We're serving 48 states in the United States right now. We've been doing it since January. You don't have to worry about that. And the cost is just as long as that everybody else is buying at the supermarkets right now. Once you have this type of whole food, you're going to go deeper down in that rabbit hole of food intelligence. And if you go to beefinitiative.com, you can find out about our conferences. You can find our Substack, which is texasslim.substack.com. And it, like going back to your wife or anybody's spouse or anybody in your family, let's look at food intelligence in a different way. And let's create a new form of awareness of what food intelligence truly is. And create a new consumption model for yourself and your family and your children. And I say start with pure animal protein. Start it through the Beef Initiative. And we're doing everything that we can to educate, to provide, to create that new consumer demand and provide a new market access to food intelligence and to pure animal protein. And once you start down that rabbit hole, you're going to go and you're going to understand how to build your communities, how to look at your food differently. And I think that we've done a very good job with our platform and our message and our conferences. So come to a conference, buy some beef, read the Substack, and you'll be able to have a new lifestyle.
Wonderful. Thanks. John Robb.
Well, I have a report that I put out monthly with extra things like podcasts and like, and what I do is really look at ways to orient your decision making. And that means taking lots and lots of different factors and trying to figure out how they all fit together so that you can actually anticipate what's coming. And at a very high level, why the politics works the way it works, what corporations are doing, where we're headed in terms of disruption and the like. It's pretty good. I mean, I've been able to figure out a lot of the basic models and frameworks for how things work. If you read my reports from 3-4 years ago, this is what always happens. It's like you could see it come true today, and it's like sometimes I wish it wouldn't come through because a lot of times they're negative, but yet it seems to work. And these orientations are great for periods of time like today where things are changing very, very rapidly. And it's hard to actually make decisions in a rapidly changing environment. And these frameworks help you do that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yep.
Phil.
I'm at ovadiahearthealth.com. I work with people to improve their health, to help them recognize the impact of the foods they're eating on their health. And ultimately, my goal is to keep people off of my operating table. So ovadiahearthealth.com has all the information, links to my podcast, my book, Stay Off My Operating Table, and ways that people can work with me.
Wonderful. Folks, thanks for joining this live stream. You can find everyone's Twitter link in whatever it is that you came to this live stream from. And love to go hear any of your comments on any of the Twitter posts where we put all this. Thank you, gentlemen, for giving your thoughts on how to eat well when times are getting weird. Take care, folks.